Good afternoon, everyone. And in this UK Internet Governance Forum that's somewhat Brexit-themed, I'm delighted to be following in the footsteps of Olivier, the chair of ISOC England. I'm Jean-Jacques Sahel, and I'm the chair of the UK chapter of the International Institute of Communications, and also the Vice President Europe at ICANN. Any UK national or foreigners are more than welcome to apply to the position of chair of the UK chapter of the International Institute of Communications. Seriously, you can. Be happy to have some help. I'm not here to tell any jokes, and I've been told many times that I should be succinct. I see people in the room trying to remind me of that. So I would like to invite to the stage Greg from Access Partnership, who's going to chair the next session, as well as Ben Cade and Robin Wilton, to talk to us about e-identification, a subject I think about every time I come back to Heathrow. So I will let you introduce, I think, the topic. Thank you.
I think in a way, well, first of all, good afternoon. Hope you can hear me. In a way, the Minister has already done a very good introduction of what precisely we're going to talk about. We're here to talk about e-identification, which sounds a little bit banal, but in fact, as Matthew Hancock reminded us, in summary, everything is already, if not connected to the net, soon will be. And that is true for all of us, whether you come from the perspective of being somebody in the on the e-commerce side who is interested by the internet as what one could describe as the greatest tool of economic development mankind has ever devised, or from the academic perspective, whereby you see the internet as the greatest resource for learning that mankind has ever conceived of. Either way, what matters to you, regardless of whether you come through Heathrow or not, if the web is the internet is going to continue to work for you, you must be able to trust what happens and believe what you read. And so it comes down to some eternal verities, which are not called e-identification, but called trust and truth. In the UK, we've had examples of the opposite of that, or at least attacks on that. Recently, you think of TalkTalk last year, and then the attack on Tesco Bank a couple of weeks ago, and the Facebook postings in the last few months, the veracity of which some people are questioning. More broadly internationally, we know that attacks on truth and trustworthiness come in the form of banalities like manipulating what happens to so-called test driving Tesla cars, all the way to more pernicious challenges of state-sponsored cyber attacks from entities that are holed up in residential blocks in Shanghai, or are openly sponsored by the same countries whose greatest minds used to turn their minds to questions of truth and trust. People like Lermontov and Tolstoy. So this is not really just about e-identification. It's about how we're going to make the internet work going forward. Now, I think that might sound dramatic, but if you contradict me, it means contradicting the minister, so I'll just put that caution to you first of all. But let's start with Robin Wilton. You've been thinking about these issues for many years. You're with the Internet Society now. Does the minister exaggerate?
Well, there was one topic on which the minister was strangely silent, and that was the IP bill. But passing on, the Internet Society, which is where I work currently, has two overarching themes for its work, and those are trust and access. Matt mentioned issues of access when he spoke about his support for things like IXPs and local networks, and that's certainly an important part of helping the internet reach more and more people. But the other overarching theme, that of trust, I think is more closely aligned with our panel topic today. And it might be useful to start with a definition. I don't know, I'm always a bit wary of starting, but let me float one anyway. So the one I've been using is this, that trust is a belief that someone will act in your interests even if they have the means and the motive to do otherwise. They'll act in your interest even if they have the means and the motivation to do otherwise. And I use the word belief because, like any belief, trust can be well-founded or poorly founded. And the things on which we base our trust decisions are many and varied. We heard in this morning's panel some of the difficulties involved in establishing a cause and effect between what people know and think and the decisions they make. Well, yes, it is tricky. And when you try and translate that into the roots of trust, especially online trust, I think what you find is that technology can only ever offer a very partial solution. It arises because if you think of the way that we first encounter trust decisions, it's face-to-face things. It's often highly contextual. I remember as a very small child coming back from school one day and being met by a parent who said, "I need to have a word with you about what your teacher said about your behaviour." And this was a huge shock to me because I thought that those contexts were completely separate. And I didn't realise that adults actually spoke to each other, especially not school teachers, who I didn't think were really genuinely human species anyway. The idea that they were talking to my parents I found quite disturbing. But that was what I would call local face-to-face trust. Well, of course, again, we heard this morning, the internet doesn't respect borders. And so we've had to come up with analogues for face-to-face trust that take account of the fact that you may have never met the person you're interacting with, or you may have never done business with the business you're now engaging with. And so the roots of our trust, the factors which play into our decision to trust a website or not trust a website, shift fundamentally from that local face-to-face model of trust. And many of those questions are still unanswered. I guess just to lead into what may emerge in further discussion, I think we often misinterpret our trust decisions online. So, for example, one of the privacy mechanisms that I recommend for people is to have a separate credit card for transactions that you undertake online. Because I've got one bank account that my salary goes into, and then I skim a little pocket money off that, and the card associated with that account is the one that I use online. Well, this is good in privacy terms because I've achieved at least some degree of risk mitigation. I'm less likely to be giving out the credit card number for my salary account. And also I'm slightly separating the transactions that I conduct online from the ones that go through my current account, joint account. So from a privacy perspective, there's a rationale behind that. But what happens on the trust side? All of a sudden what I find is that to the online merchants, I'm no longer an £N,000 a month person interacting with them. I'm a £200 a month person acting with. And so they trust me in a very different way. They trust me as a kind of low budget person interacting with them. But there's another trust dimension to this, which is to do with the liability that my bank is prepared to accept. And when I'm interacting with my low value account, the sort of bank terms and conditions seem to be strangely less favourable to when they're seeing me as a high net worth, well, a moderate net worth customer. So we sort of think, well, I'll use this credit card because it's less dangerous. But actually then perhaps I get a fraudulent transaction. I find that because it's that low value account, the bank won't stand good for it, or they won't stand good for it to the same amount. Or I didn't have travel insurance because I didn't book it through the Premier account or whatever. So I may be trusting the wrong thing in the system. I may be trusting this card because it's got a lower credit limit on it, but actually this card might have more favourable terms and conditions from the bank. So it's a really complicated set of equations. As I say, I don't think technology can offer a complete solution. I think it can offer bits of one. And that's probably quite enough for me for a minute.
Well, we can at least challenge the premise of what you said, and that is technology enough? I mean, the internet isn't a problem. It's a good thing, but it's beginning to pose a problem. So I would ask Ben Cade, CEO of Trustonic. First, you have to tell us how you came up with the name, but then we can come to that later. Can you at least outline for us in the first instance what the hierarchy of trust is in online transactions at the moment? And perhaps we can go from there as to what works and what doesn't.
Sure, absolutely. Well, firstly, to speak to the name, like most people have set up a company, you pay a lot of money to a branding agency, and then you end up with the name that somebody else suggested at the very start. It's funny, actually. I think we'll potentially arrive at the same conclusions, but I'll come at it from a different angle. Trustonic is a technology company. We're a security company. We're actually a spin-out of Arm Holdings. And what we do is we embed security into devices. And why that's important. So if you look at the context of today's discussion, EID and privacy, some might say they're sort of diagrammatically opposed options, right? You've got two stakeholders. You've got service providers, it could be a government, could be a bank, could be your instant messaging provider, streaming movie provider, whatever else. And what they want to do and what they need to do is to strongly authenticate the user, so that it is indeed Joe Bloggs trying to get into Joe Bloggs' account. On the other hand, you've got users, which is probably better put as citizens, actually, particularly in the context of today. And there really the need is to absolutely minimize the amount of personally identifiable information that I, as a user, need to put in order to gain access to a service. Hence, perhaps, I think, the root of a lot of your concerns. Now, historically, actually, the web hasn't been well set up for this. Authentication is done differently by everybody, so there's been no standard. But the methods have seemed similar. A username, a password, so great. All of that complexity means, guess what? People use the same username and the same password to log into all of these different services, and you only need one point of weakness, and actually, you really are very exposed. So what has happened there? Well, people that are really worried about that, for example, banks, they will go off and they will send you at great expense, one of these kinds of devices, which gives you what's called a second factor of authentication. So if my password is something I know, then the second factor is what's called something I have. So in this case, the bank knows that they sent me this. I can prove possession by putting in the unique code at that given moment in time, and they can reconcile that at their server. And at the same time, of course, I can put in my password. So it's secure, but it's a terrible user experience. That's not great. On the other hand, you've seen companies like Facebook and Google offer a single sign-on. So now, rather than having to remember 30 different usernames and passwords, which probably not 30 different usernames and passwords, I can log in via Facebook. And that provides greater flexibility and convenience, for sure. Theoretically, it gives you better security on the assumption that because I only have one username and one password, I will actually ensure my password is secure, and I will rotate it on a good cadence. But actually, what we've seen is it reduces the security. Just last week, there was a threat released. Over 1 billion installed Android applications were vulnerable to an easy, very simple account takeover, because what happened is the application developer didn't validate the authentication coming from Facebook or Google or anywhere else. And so what you have is the old adage, which is security is only as strong as the weakest link. So that kind of leads us to, I guess, where are we today? Well, actually, everything we've talked about today and everything pretty much we see in terms of services and apps is what I would call PC era. And it doesn't have to be that way. So the technology in devices, in mobile devices today, provides this level of hardware security. So you don't need separate dongles. So you can get the better authentication, which is good for service providers. It is good for users because it builds up confidence as there are less breaches. Clearly, your confidence in interacting digitally works. Frankly, certainly speaking to my mother, she's only just moved away from the checkbook. So, she's a long way from having any confidence in, how should I say, transacting online. But that's not enough. So I think there's 3 things that are needed. Yes, you need better security in the device. You need people's privacy to be taken care of. And that, I believe, really the onus is on the device makers. When we're talking about biometrics in this age, so whether it's your fingerprint, your iris, heartbeat, whatever else is going to pop out there, that information does not need to and should never go up to the cloud. It should never go to a service provider, because I only have one set of fingerprints and two irises, I guess. That there is no, that information needs to be very carefully kept. On the other side, as a service provider, I need to provide strong authentication. And I want to do it in a seamless way. So here you're combining technology through security with people's data in order to get access to the service. And so the last aspect really is scalability. I think there's some people here from the GSMA, potentially FIDO. These are two very important authentication frameworks. Today you've got everybody doing it differently. There's no reason for that. You're just reinventing the wheel. And what happens when you reinvent the wheel is normally you reinvent a slightly worse one. So what's needed is standards on how you authenticate, how users can authenticate themselves to devices, so that device can confirm this is user XYZ to the various applications that reside on your device, which in turn means we have a nice, simple solution to actually how you handle people's digital identity and get access to services. And I do think the final aspect is governments, they have a role to play. If you look in other regions like South Korea, for example, every citizen is given a digital identity, effectively your digital passport. Now, not every service you use needs to really know that you are Ben Cade. But there are services that do, for example, banking, for example, government gateways. And I do believe that this is the kind of responsibility area that government should be proactive in.
So just to clarify things, and the Minister talked a little bit about the need for norms and standards, and that's a very fond theme here within the Internet governance family, self-governance and sui generis norms. What standards exist currently? Perhaps this is more to you, Robin, at the moment. Which standards exist currently for authentication? What works, what doesn't? And then we can perhaps come to what solutions there could be.
Sure. Well, I think one to mention, and this is going to push back slightly on your comments about standardization of authentication. There is a standard called SAML, the Security Assertions Markup Language, which has been in use for over a decade as a standard way of exchanging authentication mechanisms. And partly this comes about because the picture is actually a little bit more complex than just a two-party relationship between a service provider and an end user. In fact, there's usually a third party involved in the role of an identity provider. The idea of federated authentication, again, comes back to this idea of how do you move on from local face-to-face trust. Federated authentication is the process where the service provider, relying on your assertion of your identity, didn't give you the identity that you're asserting. So, for example, my bank might issue me with a strong identity, which I then present to a merchant to say, you can believe this is me because the bank says so. Okay? So that federated identity already takes us beyond this idea of a two-party relationship between a service provider and an end user. And for some years now, the dominant standard in that area has been SAML. Before that, actually, I think, is John still in the room? John Bullard still in the room? No. Yes, lurking at the back. John and I were both involved in the Identris initiative, which was, again, a way of standardizing secure and interoperable authentication amongst multiple parties. So, I mean, yes, there are still a lot of different ways of authenticating out there, but there are also some standardization efforts. I've been kindly reminded from the floor that one of those is Secure ID. I'm sure the person involved will be around if anyone's got questions, and I'll point you to them at the end of the session, but I'm not here to do their marketing for them. And also, you mentioned FIDO. Again, I'm not a marketing rep for FIDO, but it's a very interesting management approach where you authenticate yourself to a little store of your digital identities, and FIDO then goes and presents the appropriate identity to the relying party. So there are practical ways out there of doing this. There are standards around, and the standard. I think the trick with the standards is, well, as usual, to pick the right one because there are so many, but also to be aware that different layers of the internet have different ways of making their standards. So kind of a bit of a caricature, but not much of one. Working your way down from the top, anything HTML-based is standardized through the W3C. Anything IP-based is standardized through the IETF, and anything below that is standardized through the ITU. That's, as I say, a little bit of a caricature, but it's not wholly inaccurate. And it gives you an idea of how those layers are split between the web interface layer, the internet or IP interface layer, and the telecoms interface layer underneath.
There's a standard that's, I don't know if it's a standard, maybe you can tell us, that's insinuating its way into some of the policy discourse in this country. You see it picked up in papers, most recently from the Department of Work and Pensions, connected to a concept of trusted execution environment. Trusted execution environment. Is this a standard? Is this a concept? Where do you see it sitting?
Do you want to start with that?
Well, happy to take that. So, well, look, this is the crossover. You're absolutely right. There are a lot of, and have been a lot of, authentication standards. Okay, so I may talk with a view to what is the simplest route to adopting something for the greater mass. And I think this is the world that we live in today. Is vastly more people developing applications and services, rather than vis-a-vis, a smaller number of companies that indeed can invest in an IT security group that will actually develop and create, the correct solution. The biggest change, however, I think between now and let's say when SAML came out during the PC era is very much the biometrics. Okay, people are starting to get comfortable with your fingerprint, or even now seeing your iris as a means to get into services. Well, however, there are huge privacy implications related to that if that information is not handled carefully. And so I think what we're looking at here is a means to provide a great solution, yes, security-wise, technologically, but more importantly, that it can scale easily, so that whether I am a one-person developer shop or I am HSBC, I can actually make use of those capabilities. Now, whether you use FIDO or GSMA Mobile Connect or some variant of OAuth or whatever else, absolutely. But you should, I think we need to establish the norms, if you like, in technology, very much in the same way as we talked about establishing norms about internet usage, whereby people are assured that when they use their biometrics, if they choose to use their biometrics, that information stays on the device, and that's the bridge by which a service provider can connect. And within that world, if you mentioned technology like the trusted execution environment, that basically is the technology that gives you that separation in the device to handle your fingerprint securely, as opposed to a piece of Android, which at the end of the day, if you're just using Android for your security, what you've got is a piece of software to protect your software against all sorts of different software threats, and that's not a good place to be.
Fair enough.
Yep. Yes, I wouldn't contest any of that. I rather charmingly in the briefing email for this, I was described as being more experienced than most in some of these things, which I think is code for I'm getting old. So let me give you some history. This increasingly seems to be my role in discussions like this. I mean, again, this doesn't contradict what's been said already, but in my youth, I worked for IBM in technical support in the delights of Basingstoke. And part of my responsibility there was training other systems engineers in, at that time, some new cryptographic hardware products that IBM had come out with. Now, this was all pre-public key, so this was all symmetric key systems. And one of the problems with symmetric key systems is that the key that you give to someone else can do all the things that you can do with the key that you've got. So if you have used your key to append effectively a signature to a message saying that it was you that sent it, and you then send it to someone who has the exact same key, the recipient can write a message of their own and sign it with the same key, and there's no technical way to tell that it didn't come from them and not you. So there's this basic, the fact that these keys are symmetric, that each of them can do what the other one can do, introduces a problem. Well, at one point, IBM introduced some hardware rules wired into the chip that allowed you to separate the functions that you could do as the owner of the key from the functions that the recipient of the message could do. And as a new systems engineer teaching my colleagues about this, I was terribly excited. I said, look, this conclusively nails down the functions of these keys, and it's totally secure because it's baked into the hardware. And the guy who was at that point in my role, i.e. the old curmudgeon in the corner, put his hand up and said, what if someone subverts the chip manufacturing process? They hadn't put that in the teacher's notes. So, of course, he was right. Now, I mean, at that point, we said, well, yes, but that's such a far-fetched thing. It'd have to be a government to do that, and so on. And since 2012, we've been aware that actually governments have been doing precisely that. So it's not so far-fetched. And we do need to work back to those vulnerabilities in the supply chain that can subvert the intended function even of hardware solutions. Now, again, I say that I'm not contesting what you say, which is true, but what it does is it shifts where you're looking for the risks and which risks you're trying to mitigate. So a couple of practical steps. I mentioned the IETF earlier, and their reaction to the Snowden revelations was that the IETF saw that as an attack on the integrity of the internet. So not Snowden. The fact that governments had been undermining the security mechanisms on which the internet depends, they perceived as an attack on the internet itself. And so they kicked off a number of things, one of which was an attempt to restore some degree of integrity and trustworthiness into the supply chain for cryptographic products. So they spun off a project called Cryptech, which is aimed at providing an open source architecture for hardware crypto. Now, the hope is that that will find its way into the mainstream and that it'll get embedded in products and standards that are then adopted by manufacturers with solutions like yours. We're in the early days of it yet, but that's one way of mitigating that risk.
Yeah. Well, just to pick up on that, I think, as you said, the key point is when you devise a security scheme, it's devised to protect against a set of threats. So, you know, if you want the secret agent level of security, you clearly need to go to a very significant level of effort to design a secure system. If you're looking to, and today's primary threats, and I absolutely agree, there are some significant nation-level threats as well that need to be considered. But the primary threats people and corporations are worried about are scalable in nature. So I'm not worried if, as a bank, I'm not worried if I hack your account or I steal your wallet, or one person steals your wallet. I'm very worried if somebody can access your account in a way that means they can access every one of my customers' accounts and take over those accounts en masse. And I think that's the balance. On the other side, as you say, there's standards, and you most definitely will know many more standards than I know. The reality is the device ecosystem picks a set of standards for a set of functions that it needs to integrate because that's what its consumers want. And the challenge for us as an industry is to bring the right technology through the right standards so that they're available in the devices broadly, so that we have a better, more functioning EID and privacy ecosystem. Oh, and by the way, sorry, it seems to be unfortunate we all have to start our careers in Basingstoke, so did I at Sony.
But it hasn't had any lasting effects.
Before you answer that, Robin, can you do better than hope about if you have a supply chain standard coming out of the IETF or any standard that is a bottom-up one? Can you do better than hope that it finds its way into the mainstream? Are there other vehicles that you could suggest that we might, we like governance questions at the IGF, but that seems like a pretty central one.
It's good, isn't it? I mean, as a techie, my underlying position is that you build the best technology you can, and of course that will capture the market. Similarly, from my ancient history, at one point I was also the branch go-to guy for IBM Token Ring. By far the best local area network technology, especially by comparison with anything shouty like Ethernet. But I think you summed it up beautifully when you said that the trick here is to find the simplest route to critical mass. We all know that as users, probably in this room a little bit less than most, but we're driven by convenience. And if you put something forward that is fantastic and does what it should do, but is slightly less convenient than the crappy alternative, people will go for the more convenient one, much to our regret. So yes, you can hope. How do you make a given technology achieve critical mass? I'm not sure you can do it sensibly through governance in every case. I think there are economic factors at play which it's very hard to forestall. I guess the parallel here is not so much with the introduction of technology, but with what happens with personal data and protecting privacy. There's a little bit of a shift in thinking, but we would like people to behave better in privacy terms, and yet convenience leads people to behave poorly in privacy terms. Can we make them behave better by regulatory means? Probably not directly. The sort of overwhelming force driving the processing of personal data online is really an economic one. It's the monetization of personal data. And so people will go for what's convenient. Service providers will offer what they can monetize most conveniently. And in those circumstances, merely regulating doesn't necessarily fix the problem. Now, this is a very unpopular view on the other side of the Atlantic, but I do think that there is a role for regulation where there's a foreseeable market failure. And if the market currently is set up to monetize people's personal data rather than give them a privacy-respectful alternative, then there's a role for regulation to step in and correct the economic incentives that drive the way that market is functioning. Now, as I say, that's taking a completely different perspective on it. But if you then step to the other side and say, well, how does that apply to trusted computing solutions? Well, if you change the economics of how those things enter the market, whether you do that by regulatory means or by coming up with the best walled garden, which is what one major manufacturer has done, then you can change the economics and you can change the adoption pattern. But I don't think there's a point solution. I think this is a systemic problem, and you have to be prepared to engage with the system at multiple points in order to change it for the better.
First of all, thank you for suggesting regulation, because it always guarantees an animated conclusion to a panel in this environment.
Just gearing up.
Yeah, but very quickly, since Ben, you're the representative of industry, if you like, on this enormous panel, have you achieved critical mass? And if you haven't, why not? And if you have, how did you do it?
Well, so it was interesting. So I took over, actually the last thing I did for ARM, I used to run a division at ARM. I founded a six-way joint venture around open source and Android and how to make that ecosystem more effective. And so in that case, it was really about how do you collaborate as industry, where you have 12, now I think over 50 people who are all effectively competitors, acknowledging that if they collaborate, rather than spending 200 engineers doing the same thing, only to get to basically the start line, you collaborate here and compete more aggressively over there. Mm-hmm. When we came back to ARM and security looked like it should be more important, it looked like it was constraining and limiting effectively the capability these devices have to actually deliver services that users really wanted. I looked at what was around there. There was a standards body called Global Platform, which traditionally represented the SIM card. And then you had this small device, this device working group. So a bunch of very, very bright people dreaming up what this new standard for trusted execution environments could look like. And I said, look, the reality is it is irrelevant unless you have some adoption in industry, which firstly you can learn by and improve, and then when you are at critical mass, it becomes relevant to be a standard. And so that's why we created Trustonic, is to say we need to move quickly because the technology is there, and the sooner we create that critical mass so that device makers can understand what they're getting is a good and sensible thing, and the sooner that service providers, a bank, can understand, well, if I make use of this technology, I can actually both improve my risk, indeed, and deliver a better experience, then standards becomes relevant. So if you like, we are the de facto leader, market leader in this marketplace, but I don't want to be the monopoly. That's not the intent. The intent is get this moving, and as that gets moving, other players will enter, And we've invested more resources than I think any other company of much larger standing in this standards body to make sure that standard is relevant and fit for purpose. But as to regulation, it's a very difficult one, I think, but I'm very controversial. I certainly see a role for a more proactive government in terms of issuing citizen IDs and providing the concept of identity that's bound to you. Regulating, obviously, is normally the last course of action, and by market failure, then you end up with Microsoft Internet Explorer, or more recently, you might call it the Google Android market failures as perceived by the Competition Committee in Europe. But it's slow in that industry. Many people have fallen by the wayside before that happens.
So, I mean, let me go back and just stress the qualification that I placed on the role of regulation, that I think it helps when it acts to correct a foreseeable market failure, or indeed a market failure that's already happening. And to give a couple of counterexamples, just to show that trying to establish technical standards and force their adoption top-down through regulation doesn't necessarily work. The example that I'd cite is around digital signatures. Okay, so we all know there's been a European Digital Signature Directive in place for years, although I always get confused as to whether it was digital signatures or electronic signatures. But anyway, there it is, and it was supposed to be a great enabler of e-commerce, and everyone was going to adopt it. And it was all based on public key infrastructure and set very high technical standards for how you ensure that the person who claims to be executing a transaction is really who they claim to be. So, for instance, at the top level of trustworthiness, you had to sign your transaction with a key pair and an algorithm supported by a secure smart card put into a secure reader, and that transaction had to happen there under your direct control. Well, it hasn't really taken off. And before I joined the Internet Society, I was doing research into PKI and PKI adoption. And one of the service providers who I dealt with said, "Oh, but that's completely pointless. People don't actually need that. We've been rolling out a secure document signing service that doesn't have anything local. People send us the document, and we send it on, and we generate an auditable record that we've done so. If they really push for it, we might sign that thing at the host. But there's not much demand for that either. This remote service that doesn't actually involve cryptography at all, but produces an audit trail, is perfectly sufficient for most people's trust requirements." And so basically they developed a solution that broke all the rules of PKI and document signing, but people found it convenient and it worked and it did what they wanted, which kind of calls into question what the benefit had been of the huge amount of effort that went into the Digital Signature Directive and all the legislation around that, and the attempts to stimulate a market for that degree of trustworthiness. Now, our appetite for trustworthy solutions and services changes over time. It might be that people are more attuned to the idea of digitally signing documents these days. But for me, that whole episode reinforced the view that we should always question what it is that we're using as the basis for our trust decisions. Was that service more trustworthy because I was signing it on my PC with my smart card, or was it perfectly adequately trustworthy because someone else was creating an auditable record of what had happened? So it kind of comes back to that opening trust question. I think we need to constantly re-question the basis for our trust decisions, and sometimes challenge the assumptions that things can only happen in a trustworthy way under circumstances X, Y, and Z.
I mean, unfortunately, I think the reality is most people choose convenience, as you absolutely say. They don't care, or when they do care, it's too late. And and that is very much the challenge. And people's, the millennials' trust is with people like Facebook and that era of technology company, and not with people that we potentially would have trusted more as a bank until the financial meltdown, and people had different views on how much they trusted their banks. But I do think to the role of regulation, I'm not a fan of regulation, except where there is a clear market failure. I challenge you to tell me where it's foreseen a market failure, but that's another point. But I do like what's happening, for example, at the National Cyber Security Centre. It changes its name every 3 months or so I'm just learning it. Where what they're really looking to do is provide clearer, easier to understand guidelines to say this is what you should do if you are an individual and you're worried about privacy, or you are an application developer and you're worried about privacy. And I looked at it on the train home last night, and it's short. It's a couple of pages that you scroll through. It's not a long and difficult exercise to start getting into. And as you look at that, most of the advice falls around 3 areas. How do you protect data at rest on the device? How do you provide a strong authentication to the user? And the third one is kind of related to that, but how do you protect biometric data? And how do you collect it, and how do you utilize it? And I think as people can start understanding and simplify the search space, that will help. But absolutely, the biggest challenge, I think, is there is probably more obligation on technology companies to make it easy for people who want to build services that actually they are built by default secure when they appear on these platforms, which means we need to build better foundations. And then on the other side, I think the device makers need to make sure that those important credentials aren't leaking out of the device. But all things can be subverted. That's the problem.
Briefly, before we go to questions.
Yeah, sure. Just on that, stepping back a little bit and taking the longer view, I do think that that any identity scheme, and particularly national-scale government identity schemes, if they cannot cater for pseudonymous or anonymous access to services or assertion of attributes, they are deficient. They are not meeting the full set of requirements they should meet. I think back to a session I attended a while ago at...
I'm sorry, and that's related to the concept of privacy that you want to preserve?
I think it is. It's also related to the concept of self-determination and autonomy, particularly with biometrics, for instance. So I was thinking back to goodness, I can't remember what it was called at the time, but it was the thing that was the BER, the business and...
Well, Matthew Hancock was here representing.
The lot at the top of Victoria Street, yeah? I can't remember, so that'll give you some idea of roughly what time period we're talking about. But the chief architect for identity and security on that stood up and explained how our national identity card would have on the chip a facsimile image of all 10 of our fingerprints. And I couldn't believe what he was saying. It seemed to me that if that data was on there and it was held somewhere else and it was accessible to someone else, then anyone else could produce a facsimile of the fingerprints of any registered individual. And I didn't think that was a very good thing. So I went up and I said, well, look, why on earth are you storing the facsimile image? Why don't you take the fingerprint, hash it, and store the hash? And he said, oh, well, we found that the hash verification usually fails if we do that. I didn't think that was, I didn't think his alternative to that was a better solution. But to me it illustrated that actually if you set up an identity system like that and you take away from the user the ability to replace a failed biometric, if you don't introduce in the architecture that level of abstraction that means that, okay, that hash for that fingerprint was compromised, so I will generate a different hash for the same fingerprint, or I will generate another hash for a different fingerprint, then, as I say, I think your solution is defective. Obviously, this is something where our ideas mature over time, but in principle, I want identity systems to cater for anonymity, to cater for pseudonymity under the user's control, and to give the user the ability to make trustworthy assertions of attributes in addition to just trustworthy assertions of identity. And I think if they can do that, they're moving towards a fully functional set of requirements.
We have time for about 2 questions before I'd like to ask the panelists for predictions. The lady to my right here. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Julie Dawson from Yoti. Hi, Robert. I just wondered, given what we can find out about people online, are knowledge-based authentication questions something that we should really reconsider, given that they're at the basis of a lot of the great work that was done a good while ago in things like our GPG 45, which then form the basis of a lot of our levels of assurance?
Do you want to go on that one?
Absolutely. So certainly, I think there's a separation between how you as a service provider establish the authenticity of the end user and establish that point. That, to me, is parallel to how the user then authenticates themselves, registers themselves for that service, in which case, clearly that has to be some means of, I know it is Ben Cade, maybe I've asked them a bunch of knowledge-based questions, but once you've established that person's identity, then in the world that we have today with biometrics, assuming you buy into the story of biometrics, then actually henceforward, all I need to do is have a request from that application to say, please check this is user XYZ, and the device will give you a simple yes or no based on my fingerprint or my iris or whatever else. So I do think knowledge-based questions are there, but it's, to me, that harks back to every service, even with a standard on authentication, every service provider will still handle the personalization aspect differently.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And the ones that I hate are the ones where you just get a drop-down box and it says which was your first school, what was the name of your first pet. Knowledge-based questions are a shared secret. And as we all know, there is no such thing as a shared secret. So I think, first, if you're going to do that, first, it's always instructive to ask an organisation, how much care do you take over the passwords that you store? And then they tell you. And then you say, how much care do you take over the data that is the answers to the knowledge-based questions? And the security mechanisms applied to those are seldom, if ever, equivalent to the ones applied to the passwords. When did you see salted hashes for the answers to the knowledge-based questions? Right. I would like, if people are going to use those, I would like them to be free format questions, where you get to say what the question is and you get to specify what the answer is. But I think the second thing that has to go with that is user education. Because obviously the best thing to do then is that as a user, if you can then type in the question, what is your favorite dessert? And then you can select the answer, which is Beethoven's Fifth, then you're well set up, because it's going to be very hard for anyone to look that up on Facebook. Yeah? So I favour free format and I favour user education to make people a bit more savvy about how they use that kind of mechanism.
I regret we're going to have to wrap it up. Before we do that, in 30 seconds, to each of you, what is the single most important factor that is going to drive trust in our dealings on the internet in the future?
Wow.
Do you want to start with that?
Shall I start?
Yeah, please do.
Give
us some time.
A recognition that trust is a social construct, and therefore it depends on a lot more things than just technology. Technology has a role to play, as we've explored, but trust is a social thing. It's a thing about social interaction, and that's the set of problems we need to approach and solve.
I'd actually second that. I agree. I think we have a challenge, which is partially generational, but partially just to do with the disruptive nature of technology, of what trust is in the context of the digital world, and at what point we should trust some things more and other things less. That said, I also believe that the big difference is you can't have trust without security. That's one of the fundamental premises we effectively sell upon. But that in itself is also not enough. You need to have that awareness, and you need to have those use cases that people say, that adds value to my daily life, but it is a distinctly valuable asset, and therefore I want to know that that information is securely kept and prudence is applied. And unfortunately, I certainly don't see a good or simple answer to that.
Our thanks to Robin Wilton and Ben Cade for this. It's a heavy topic. You've enlightened us a little bit anyway. Thank you all for participating.